In Revelation 14, we are introduced to a group of people who will be alive at the second coming of Christ. This chapter presents them as going through a time of trouble such as never was before, and being translated from among the living. Many people today have ignored certain scriptural passages and concluded that because of the description above, none who have died in the third angel's message will be among the sealed, or the 144,000. Such a notion, however, does not correctly correspond with what the Bible and the spirit of prophecy present. Towards the end of the 14th chapter of Revelation we read, "And I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, Write, Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth. Yea, saith the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them." Who are the dead who will be blessed, of which the voice from heaven is speaking? Well, as per verse 1, there's only one company of people that this chapter is speaking of, and that company is those who keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus. This passage indicates a starting point by using the phrase "from henceforth." It is not difficult to understand that in order for us to know when the henceforth begins, we have to deal with the information presented in the verses above. The connection between chapters 7 and 14 of Revelation is evident, for in both chapters we find a description of the same group of people, the 144,000. In the beginning of chapter 7, we learn that the four winds of heaven are held back until all the servants of the Lord are sealed in their foreheads. This sealing process is directly related to the third angel's message, which brings to view the fourth commandment as a sign between God and His people. Thus, one cannot be sealed unless he or she is aware of the significance of the third angel's message and has been led to keep all the commandments of God. The process of the sealing indicates a progression of time, and this time frame is further described as the preaching of the third angel's message in chapter 14. Therefore, the sealing time spoken of is the time given for the preaching of the third angel's message, which commences with the close of probation. It is widely known that the Seventh-day Adventist movement came to a full understanding of the fourth commandment around the year 1848, and from that time those who have kept all the commandments of God have been preaching this truth to the world. Thus we can conclude that the blessing bestowed upon all those commandment-keeping people began back in the time of 1848. Every believer who has kept the commandments of God, had the faith of Jesus, as well as the rest of the characteristics of the 144,000 as they are described in the Bible, has been sealed and will be a part of those who will be alive to welcome Christ at His second coming. Now, in order for them to be alive at the second coming of Christ, having died before that time, they must be resurrected prior to His appearance in the clouds of heaven. If this is so, the Bible and spirit of prophecy will confirm it. Indeed, the Bible speaks of a special resurrection that takes place before the Lord appears in the clouds of glory. We find this in the books of Daniel and Revelation. Daniel chapter 12 begins with the close of probation, being the period when Christ will cease His mediatorial work in the heavenly sanctuary and prepare to come in the clouds of glory. The chapter then continues, "And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." In Revelation 1:7 we read, "Behold, He cometh with clouds, and every eye shall see Him, and they also which pierced Him, and all kindreds of the earth shall wail because of Him." How is it that those who pierced Christ shall see Him at His second coming, if they have been dead for nearly 2,000 years? From the teachings of the Bible we know that only the righteous dead are resurrected at the second coming of Christ, and that the wicked will remain in their graves for another 1,000 years. However, as outlined in the book of Daniel, there will be a partial or special resurrection that will take place between the close of probation and the second coming of Christ. Those resurrected to shame and everlasting contempt are the group of people prophesied of in Revelation 1:7. We have already understood that the 144,000 will be the only righteous group of people alive at the second coming of Christ. Thus, those found in Daniel 12 that are raised to everlasting life are the blessed group of faithful believers who have died sealed in the third angel's message and are to be reckoned among the 144,000. The only point where the prophecies make a place for this event is at the time mentioned in Revelation 16:17. This is at the beginning of the 7th plague, when the great voice out of the temple of heaven from the throne utters the solemn words, "It is done." This voice shakes both heaven and earth, but speaks deliverance to the people of God. The spirit of prophecy clearly speaks of this event on several occasions. The voice shakes the heavens and the earth. There is a mighty earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake and so great. Graves are opened, and many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. All who have died in the faith of the third angel's message come forth from the tomb glorified to hear God's covenant of peace with those who have kept his law. They also which pierced him, those that mocked and derided Christ's dying agonies, and the most violent opposers of his truth and his people, are raised to behold him in his glory and to see the honor placed upon the loyal and obedient. The argument here might arise that this cannot be so, for the Bible speaks of the 144,000 coming out of great tribulation, which cannot really be said of those who sleep in the grave until 6 of the 7 plagues are fulfilled. But let's give this a little more thought. Rising just prior to the 7th plague, they pass through the whole period of the judgment and witness all its accumulated calamities. The plagues are said to come in 1 day, or 1 year when understood prophetically, which would allow an approximate period of 2 months after the 7th vial begins to be poured out until the end of time. The plagues are also cumulative. The first does not cease when the second begins, but the second adds to it, and so forth for each one until the 7th. In the 7th plague is therefore found the climax and accumulation of them all. This can only lead us to conclude that even though some of those who have died in the message are resurrected just before the 7th plague, they will live through all the plagues, and it can rightfully be said of them that they have come out of great tribulation. In fact, Ellen White writes of a person who will be among them. I saw that she, Mrs. Hastings, who had just died, was sealed and would come up at the voice of God and stand upon the earth, and would be with the 144,000. I saw we need not to mourn for her. She would rest in the time of trouble. Who are the people being sealed in Revelation 7? It is the 144,000 only. When would she come up? At the voice of God, which we learn is just prior to the 7th plague. When was she to rest? In the time of trouble, namely the first 6 plagues. Then she will be resurrected before the 7th to be with the 144,000. It is impossible to apply any other reasoning here, because Mrs. Hastings was to stand upon the earth and is not caught up into heaven as would be the rest of the righteous dead, who will be resurrected not at the voice of God, but at the second coming of Christ. Friends, the devil has tried to obscure this truth in order for us to lose the faith and light given to our pioneers. Mrs. Hastings must have had a proper understanding of the third angel's message, and she must have been keeping all the commandments of God and must have had the faith of Jesus. As a result of her faith, she was sealed and among the 144,000. Those who died in this message are blessed. They are crowned at last with the peculiar privilege of composing the cabinet of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and will be joyful in his constant presence and sustained by his unfailing grace. May the Lord help us to strive to be among them.